Hi and welcome. Today we are talking about structure. We're doing a deep dive into what are the three acts, what we're supposed to see in each one, what we usually see in each one, what are turning points, which are the turning points in your story, and how to best incorporate these concepts into your own creative process. Something to consider when you're starting to learn about what turning points are and which ones they are and how they're important is that initially, they're a little more useful as an analysis tool when you're analyzing scripts and movies. They can be very clear when you're doing that. In your own creative process, some are going to come more organically than others, and that's totally fine. So as we move on through the lesson and we talk about turning points, what they are, which ones they are, which act has each one, keep that in mind. It's not always going to be very clear in your process what your turning points are going to be. As long as you know more or less where your story is going, as long as you know the answer to your dramatic question, which is a concept I've covered in my previous video, Introduction to Structure, you should be fine. And as you progress in your process, these turning points are going to become a little more clear. So again, don't worry if they're not really clear from the get-go. So just a little recap. Stories usually are told in 3 acts. Some people disagree with that. Some people say it's only 1 act. We're going to cover these theories a little further down the line. But for now, for where we are in our process and where we're learning, let's consider stories to have 3 acts, 3 parts, beginning, middle, and end. When we talk about turning points, we need to understand what those are. What we've covered in our previous video is that we meet our characters in a balance in their status quo. Something shifts that status quo, which means the story takes a turn. That's what turning points are. They're moments in the story where your story changes direction. Your story is going one way and then it goes another way. Your character is going in one direction and then he starts going in another direction. Those are turning points. They're shifts in the story. They could be positive shifts, they could be negative shifts, but there are shifts. And as we talk about them today, and after you learn about these concepts when you sit down and watch a movie or you sit down to read a script, they should become a little more clear and you're going to notice those shifts. So let's talk about Act 1. When we're talking about Act 1, we're talking about the beginning of our story. Another way to look at it is a setup. We're setting up our story. We're setting up the playing field. The time, the place, the circumstances, your character's status quo, your character's life at balance. That's how most movies start. That's how most stories start. Again, we can stray from the rules. They're not really rules, they're tools, but it's important to know them so we can break them. Know the rules to break them. Know the tools to ignore them, and that's fine. Act 1, character in their status quo. We meet our character in somewhat of a balance. It might be a frayed balance. It might be a fragile balance. Their life might be chaos. Even if it's chaotic, that's life as they know it. Every day they wake up and that's their life. This does not mean that we want to see wake-up scenes. Wake-up scenes are boring. Everybody wakes up and brushes their teeth and has coffee. That's not what I mean. I mean, what's their routine? What's their life at work like? What's their life at home like? Let's get little snippets of the status quo. Of course, there are great wake-up scenes. When we think about the amazing movie Sound of Metal, we get to see our characters waking up in their morning routine. It's a very specific morning routine. They live in an RV. They're into fitness. He does these like nasty green juices that he basically forces his girlfriend to drink. Those are very specific. We're not seeing him wake up, brush his teeth, and have coffee. As we get into this routine, we get a glimpse into our character's normal life. There's going to be a small shift into this character. It's the first little intrusion to the stability that we've witnessed. Something that just changes that stability a little bit. That little shift, the first shift in the story, is called the inciting incident. The inciting incident is something that happens early on in the movie where we get a glimpse of what is to come. We get the first hint that things are gonna go a little bit differently. It could be a job interview, like in The Devil Wears Prada. It could be kids find a map in the attic, like in The Goonies. Those are inciting incidents. What happens with the inciting incident, though, is that it doesn't necessarily send our character on a journey or on a wild goose chase. What happens is that because the shift to stability is subtle, it's not a huge thing, we're gonna see our character immediately react to that and try to get their life back to normal by either ignoring the inciting incident or thinking it's not that big of a deal, or going through the motions that someone would normally do. For example, Melanie Lynskey in I Don't Feel at Home in This World Anymore, she has her home broken into, she calls the police. That's a normal thing because she quickly wants to go back to her life. But what we tend to see in first acts is that once our character tries to get back to his stable life, they're not lazy attempts necessarily, although sometimes they are, but they're the easiest way, the easiest path back to stability. It's usually not going to work. First acts, to recap, we see our character living their normal life. There's a small intrusion into that stability. There's a small shakeup of the status quo. That's the inciting incident. We're going to see our character react to that inciting incident and try quickly to return to their normal life. And it's not going to work. After our character has tried to solve the problems that have come up by the inciting incident and they have failed, a dramatic question is going to be formed. Our character is going to need to achieve something external to them, a goal, something that they're going towards in order to recreate the balance that they fought so hard for. So they have the inciting incident, small shakeup of their status quo, they react to that, trying to quickly return to their normal life, and it's going to fail. And then suddenly they're going to see themselves faced with a big challenge, something they're going to have to achieve in order to go back to their normal life. And that is how most first acts are structured. We see Brody, in my evergreen example of Jaws, living his life in the small island where he feels like an outsider, he's scared of the water, and then he comes up upon a body on the beach. That's the inciting incident. This body on the beach could be anything. It could be a boating accident. It could be something that's not going to require too much work from him. So that's his reaction to the inciting incident, trying to figure out what happened quickly so that he could go back to his normal life. The first act turning point, though, is the discovery that it's been a shark attack. There's a shark in the water, and they're going to have to kill the shark. Will Brody kill the shark? Yes or no? The first act turning point in this case is, it's a shark, we need to kill it. There is no turning back. Brody will not be able to return to his normal life until he kills the shark. In my other favorite example, Finding Nemo, it's the first day of school. That's the inciting incident. It's the first sign of instability in Marlin's life, our protagonist, Nemo's dad. It's the first day of school, and he's trying to do what he always does, which is keep his son safe, control him, not let any harm come to him. So he's reacting to that. He's just trying to get through the day, get him to school, get him back. But what happens? Nemo is taken by humans. And now Marlin must do the thing he fears the most, which is expose himself to danger and cross the vast ocean to find his son. That's the first act turning point. His son is taken away, and now Marlin must find him. Will Marlin find Nemo? It's the title of the movie, right? Those are first act turning points. Once you know what first act turning points are, they are very easy to spot when we're analyzing other movies. Inciting incidents sometimes are very subtle, and sometimes it's really hard to spot them, and that's okay. Usually, the first act turning point is crystal clear. As far as you writing your own stories, it is really important to know what your first act turning point is going to look like. It is one of those very important ones that we have to know early on. And usually we do know, and that's fine. But more importantly, to know the ins and outs of your first act turning point, you have to know what your dramatic question is. What's the dramatic question? What's the answer? So to recap, our first act will see our character living their normal life, their status quo. There's going to be a small shift to that status quo. Our character is going to react to that shift. Those attempts at stabilization are going to fail. And eventually, our character is going to have to make a decision to pursue a goal, and then there's no turning back. A dramatic question is raised. It's only going to be answered at the end of the movie. Yes or no questions. And that's our first act turning point. And I Don't Feel at Home in This World Anymore. It's the moment where Melanie Lynskey notices the police is not going to do anything to recover her grandmother's silver, and she is going to take matters into her own hands and go on an investigation to find her stolen stuff. So that's our Act 1. A lot of times when we're writing, Act 1 comes somewhat clearly to us because that's the beginning of our story. A lot of times that's where our creative process is, and that's fine. Once we go into Act 2, and the first act turning point is the transition between Act 1 and Act 2 because their character has turned in their story. They were living somewhat of a normal life. and now they've turned towards the journey that they're going to have to follow through until the end. Now we're in Act 2. Act 2 tends to be the most challenging one to write. And when we're watching movies, a lot of times it's where movies lose steam a little bit. Act 2 is your longest act. It takes about 60% of your movie, even if it's a short film, if it's a feature film. It's where we're going to see our character overcome harder and harder challenges in order to get what they want. Not only that, our character is going to probably meet new people, make new friends, make new enemies, figure out who's a friend and who's an enemy, maybe go through some tests along the way, and eventually we're going to get into Act 3. But before that, let's look at Act 2. Act 2 seems really long, right? And when we were talking about characters, there's some classes on that. Check them out if you haven't. We've established that characters, they have an external goal, right? And that's what we're talking today here about structure. Characters are going towards something external to them. Killing a shark, finding your son, getting your grandma's stuff back. But also, characters are going through an internal journey. They're changing. They have some kind of theory about the world in the beginning of the movie that's going to be challenged and maybe changed by the end. They're going to have some trauma in the beginning of the movie that's going to have to be overcome somehow by the end of the movie. And why do I bring that up? Because character and structure are completely intertwined. And that is especially true in the midpoint. The midpoint is the third turning point we're talking about today. We've talked about the inciting incident, a small shift, not a huge turning point, but an important one. We're talking about first act turning point, the big turning point where it sets our character off on their journey. The midpoint is exactly what it sounds. It's the turning point that happens in the middle of the movie. And as you watch movies, if you're watching movies that you like, I challenge you to pause in the middle of the movie. Get your runtime, divide it by 2, and find something there in the middle and look at it. Because I can almost guarantee you that something really interesting is happening in the midpoint. The midpoint has kind of 2 different angles that you can look at them. And a lot of good movies explore both of these angles. There is a plot angle and there's a character angle. I will explain. A lot of times, films are structured in a way where your character has an external goal, right? The midpoint of the movie is a small victory that your character might have that makes them closer to that goal. It might be even a false sense of accomplishing that goal, right? So midpoints are small victories that propel our character closer to their goal. Let me give you some examples with movies that we've talked about today. In Jaws, the goal is to kill the shark. The midpoint of the movie finds a group that has been gathered together, a team that has been gathered, and they're on a boat. They hop on the boat, they hop on the orca, and they are going towards the shark. They're going to kill the shark. It's a small victory for Brody. He's closer than ever to killing the shark because now he's on the boat and he's literally going towards the shark. They're going to find him and they're going to kill him no matter what. Another example of a good midpoint is in the movie Almost Famous. Almost Famous sees our character, William, trying to write a story for Rolling Stone magazine. That's the dramatic question. Will William be able to write the story for Rolling Stone magazine? The midpoint of the movie finds William getting a phone call from his editor saying, "We really like what you're doing. We're considering you for the cover." It's a small victory for him. What also happens in a lot of movies as far as midpoints go is when characters that have been at odds up to that point, they pair up and decide to go together towards their goal. Some clear examples are in Moana, for example. Moana and Maui have been at odds. Maui does not want to help Moana on her journey. The middle of the movie finds them shaking hands and agreeing that they each have their own interests, but they're going to go together to deliver the heart of Te Fiti to save Moana's island. So that's how midpoints work as far as plot goes. But I did mention that midpoints also have a character angle. Because remember when we were talking about characters, they change throughout the movie. They start a certain way, they end a certain way. They have ideas in the beginning of the movie that they might be different by the end. They have traumas that they overcome. They have wounds that they heal. The midpoint is also the first sign of change. We're going to see our character starting to change. It's going to be the first sign that they are going through something and that they're changing and that they're not the same as they were in the beginning of the movie. So in Jaws, We see Brody hop on a boat. That's a character victory for him. He's overcoming or starting to overcome his fear of water. In Nemo, it's really beautiful because in Finding Nemo, Nemo is a fish that is stuck in the past, right? He can't overcome the past. So who has he been paired with? Dory, a fish that literally lives in the present. So the midpoint of the movie is the first time we see Marlin. So the midpoint in Finding Nemo is when we see Marlin show his first signs of bravery and loyalty towards Dory. Dory gets stuck in these jellyfish and Marlin must save her. And not only does he show the sign of bravery and his sign of friendship towards her, so characters that have been at odds are now on the same page, he does so in a playful way. He races her. He does this little game, something he wasn't able to do in the beginning of the movie when we see him taking his son to school for the first time. It's his first sign of bravery. It's his first sign of being a little more carefree. It's his first sign of loyalty towards Dory. These are all character shifts that happen within Marlin. So that is his character shift. And not only that, he's rewarded on a plot level by getting to the current. That's the current that's been established is going to take him to where he has to go. That's where he meets the turtles. So midpoints, good midpoints, operate on both levels. They give us a character victory, something that the character is changing, and they give us some kind of plot advancement, a small victory that our character might have. In Almost Famous, it's a coming of age story. So boy becomes man, and the way that Almost Famous explores that, maybe in a little bit of an inappropriate way, is that William loses his virginity, and that's his kind of character changing there. He's not the same boy he was before. And at the same time, he gets the call from his editor that his story is now going to be the cover. So there's a character victory and a plot victory. Midpoints are often overlooked in people's processes, but they're super important because they kind of help you gain steam for the rest of your second act. So we've seen the character act a certain way and not able to achieve any victory for the first half of your second act. Something happens in the midpoint, and now we're going to see our character a little bit changed, a little more motivated after he's got a little sense of the victory. And that's going to give us steam for the second half of the movie. We're now seeing our character changed a little bit. Our character might have gotten a small little victory, and as things progress, characters are going to get more and more desperate into trying to get their goal. They can't wait to go back to their normal life. So what happens in a lot of movies is that we see what we call the second act turning point. I want to hone in on the second act turning point a little bit because it's often misunderstood and it's often labeled as something that it's not always. A lot of people consider the second act turning point as a low point or maybe a crisis, and it might be that. In most kids' movies, there is a major setback that happens towards the end of the second act. A lie is revealed, like in Aladdin, or Marlin gets swallowed by the whale. There's something that happens that makes our character lose hope. It's a huge setback. It is such a common trope at this point that I have a 6-year-old daughter who once told me, "Oh mom, this is the sad part," which means the movie's almost over. Moana and Maui part ways. They each go in their separate direction. So a second act turning point might be a low point, but it might not be. Your story might not have the need for a major setback, and that's totally fine. Sometimes when we're watching films, we can't really spot the second act turning point. All of a sudden, we just notice we're in Act 3. We're going towards the final confrontation or the final big climactic sequence, which we'll cover in a second. And that's totally fine. So the second act, we'll see our character face a crisis or face a setback or not. What might also happen is that we've seen our character start to change, right? And the midpoint. And maybe the second act turning point, we see our character revert to their old ways, go back to their old traumas and their old wounds. If you're thinking about your story and you don't see that space in your story for this huge reversal after the midpoint and before the big final sequence, that's fine. Have the confidence to not mold your story into something that it's not. That's what I mean by tools for your toolbox and not rules in a rule book. Because They are things that are there to help you tell your story and not a path you have to follow in order to tell a good story. Have confidence in your vision to know that your story might not have a huge setback. When you're watching movies, however, pay attention to movies that do that. We also call the second act turning point the crisis moment or the dark night of the soul. Animation writers call it the dark night of the soul. And they actually a lot of times are visually dark moments of the movie. Marlin gets swallowed by the whale, right? It's a dark moment in the movie. In Inside Out, it's when the characters have to let go of the imaginary friend. It's a dark part in an otherwise very bright movie. So an interesting way to spot that is when the scene actually goes dark. A movie that explores these turning points really well and has a second act turning point that's not necessarily a setback, but it's still a dark moment for a character, Groundhog Day. It has a very So let's talk about Groundhog Day for a second. Groundhog Day is a very sophisticated movie, but it actually follows 3-act structure to a T. We meet Phil, and Phil is a grumpy man who thinks he's so above being a weatherman for a small local TV station. And the first sign of instability in his life is Rita. There's a new producer, Rita. That's the first sign that things are not going to be the same. So we follow Phil, and he goes to Puxatawny, and all of a sudden he's stuck on Groundhog Day. It's the day he hates the most. He hates that day so much, he hates having to do that, and he's stuck there. That's his first act turning point. He's stuck in that journey. And now we're only going to finish this movie when we find the answer. Will Phil ever be able to wake up the next day? The midpoint finds Phil loosening up his barriers, really. It's a very character-driven midpoint. He finally opens up, has a wonderful date with Rita, and they connect. They have a moment, they almost kiss, they dance. That's the first sign of things to come. As the movie progresses, he starts losing hope because he's doing all these things, but he's still waking up on Groundhog Day every single day. So what happens is that throughout this movie, Phil befriends this unhoused man, and he becomes very connected to this man. But no matter what he does, the man always dies. So the end of the second act sees Phil trying everything he can to make this man not die. And no matter what, he fails. And that makes him lose all hope. And he's so sad that he tries to take his own life. And he still wakes up and it's still Groundhog Day. So your character might have this moment of loss of hope. They might have this moment of a major setback, a lie that is revealed is a very common trope in romantic comedies that are based on lies, from like 10 Things I Hate About You, for example. The lie is revealed, this couple is torn apart. Very common second act turning point. Your film might also not have something that's very clear. So in Jaws, for example, there's nothing very clear that differentiates Act 2 to Act 3. They're having this great moment on the boat, they're talking, they're sharing stories. There's this one of the best monologues delivered in all times in all movies. And all of a sudden, the shark's there. And they're going into their third act confrontation. Think of your own story. If there is an organic need for a major setback, for loss of hope, for characters returning to their old ways, by all means incorporate that into your story. If your story doesn't have a need for that, ignore it. When you're watching films, it's the same thing. If you see that moment, if you see this really clear loss of hope and things go back to the way they were, then great, that's your second act turning point. If you don't exactly feel that and all of a sudden you notice that you're going towards the end of the movie, it's because the film didn't fall into the temptation of molding itself into something that it wasn't. So we've covered 4 turning points so far: the inciting incident, the first act turning point, the midpoint, and the second act turning point. So now we're going to cover the last one, which is the climax. The climax is the biggest moment in your film that's going to answer the dramatic question. In a lot of movies, it's actually a big energetic moment. It's a party or a wedding or man versus shark. It's the moment that the audience is going to know whether that goal was achieved or not. That's what the climax is. Sometimes it's a huge scene. It's the whole sequence of Brody and his buddies trying to kill the shark. Sometimes it's just something a little bit smaller, like Nemo and Marlin are reunited in the ocean. Has found his father has found his son. That's the climax of the movie. And I Don't Feel at Home in This World Anymore, it's when Melanie Linsky's character finally confronts the thieves that stole her stuff. That's a climax. A climax is the answer to your dramatic question. And the scope of your climax is going to depend on the scope of your story. In the wonderful Academy Award winning movie Moonlight, what we're seeing is a character struggling with his own identity as a gay man. He's a drug dealer and he's a gay man, and he's struggling with that identity, and we don't know if he's ever going to come to terms with that part of his identity or not. The climax of the movie sees our character lowering his barriers, actually opening up and revealing himself to be in love with another character. And that is it. It's huge, but it's small. It doesn't have to be a shootout like in Reservoir Dogs. It doesn't have to be man versus beast like in Jaws. What a lot of movies do is that they create an event to give that energy to the third act. For example, in Groundhog Day, the answer to the dramatic question is, will Phil wake up the next day in Groundhog Day? Right? That's a very small moment. It's a man waking up. So the movie designs a wedding. So the movie ends on a party. So we have this feeling of raising energy, even though the climax of the movie is a very small moment. It's him waking up next to Rita. So your climax, instead of thinking it in terms of a big shootout or a big dramatic sequence or something really big, think of it in terms of character. Our character is going to achieve their goal or not. In movies like Father of the Bride or Rocky, the climax is organically going to be something big. In Father of the Bride, it's the wedding itself. In Rocky, it's the fight. So some movies are going to organically have this big event that is the third act. In Jaws, it's going to be man versus shark. But in some films, it's something a little bit smaller. It's the moment our character realizes if they're getting their goal or not. That's the climax. When we're thinking about our movie, those are the most important moments you have to think about early on is your first act turning point, the raising of the dramatic question, and the climax. Even if you don't know exactly how that climax is going to play out, you should at least know as a storyteller what the answer to the dramatic question is. Is it yes or no? Is character going to get what they want or not get what they want? To wrap up this talk today, it's important to know that the climax does not divide your third act in two. The climax is usually very close to the end of the movie, but what we see happen after the climax is what we call the resolution. The resolution is these really quick scenes, and they usually don't take more than 4 or 5 minutes, where we see our character return to their normal life, but completely changed because of the events of the movie. So after something like Mission Impossible, right, Fallout, I think, there's this huge moment and they deactivate the bomb and they literally save the world, right? And then we see all our characters returning to their normal life and grabbing a beer. This is really well explored in this wonderful video by Lindsay Duran called Kissing the Girl versus Saving the World. It's here on YouTube. You should definitely check it out. And she talks a lot about this idea of resolution. But what happens, for example, in Finding Nemo, right? We see Marlin finds his son. After everything that Marlin has gone through, has he changed? So after he finds his son, Dory gets swept up in this net, in this fishing net. And Nemo is the only fish that can save her. So he swims into the net to save her. But Marlin's not going to let him go. He swam the whole ocean to try and find him. And now he's not just going to let his son go, but we want to see if Marlin has changed or not. So Nemo pleads with his dad. He's like, Dad, please, I have to find her. I have to save her. I'm the only fish that can save her. So what do we see? We see Marlin letting go of Nemo, figuratively and literally. And he lets Nemo try and save Dory. And he saves her. It's great. Not only that, after that, we see Marlin back at his little anemone, and we see him a completely changed fish. After everything he's done, he's found Nemo, and now he's this cool dad, he's way more relaxed, and he's realized that his son has to live life. He can't protect his son forever. So that's what the resolution is. It's the character returning to their normal life, balance has been restored, but life will never be the same again. So those are the 5 turning points that most movies have, and yours may or may not have. Again, tools for your toolbox, things for your process. If they help you, great. If they're not, file them in a little file cabinet in your brain and do what feels right for you.